A lot of Rareware games have been described as their take on popular Nintendo ideas. You can kind of start this tradition with Donkey Kong Country, which many see as kind of Rareware's take on the design of Super Mario World, kind of taking a game that was, bigger, more exploration focused, and making kind of writing its design in a way to streamline it in a way. There's a lot of a memorization focus in Donkey Kong Country, but the movement systems are very consistent, they're very fun, and there's kind of an elegant simplicity to the whole thing, especially in the presentation, the lack of HUD, the beautiful kind of pre-rendered graphics that are realistic in a way. And in a similar vein, Nintendo 64, Rareware had plenty of games. This is their most prolific generation. People see Diddy Kong Racing as a counterpart to Mario Kart 64, and that makes sense to me as well. Both are party racing games. Diddy Kong kind of innovated in many ways. It's less like a different version of Mario 64 and more like an expanded kind of title in its design. They add more vehicles, and they also have a story mode, and it feels a little more in-depth. Banjo Kazooie is kind of interesting because you immediately kind of think like, okay, this is their take on Mario 64, right? Their big 3D platformer game. But it kind of isn't like that. And I think the first place to look for in terms of understanding this game is its origins, because Banjo Kazooie came from what was known as Project Dream, which was an RPG for Super Nintendo. I don't have all of the facts completely straight on its development, but from what I remember, it was an isometric game with pre-rendered graphics. It starred completely different characters. Banjo, the bear, was in the game, but as a bit of a smaller role. And it has, I guess in the graphical 3D dimension, the 3D world, the game kind of developed into a bit of a platformer kind of title. But for as much as Banjo is a platformer, and as much as it kind of innovated this idea of the collectathon, I think this game still has a pretty clear influence from RPGs and adventure games. It's almost like very similar to Ocarina of Time in a way. It's interesting because the way stuff works in Banjo-Kazooie is it's a platformer game where you have objectives, kind of like very, similar to Mario 64 in its structure, but the way you solve objectives is much more personality based, and it's much more move based. What I mean by that is, there are some things that you want to get, what you want to do, but there's a proverbial key to the lock. There's a move you have to find, a move you have to unlock or learn, maybe a NPC you have to find or talk to, or some other thing. You have to do something in the overworld that kind of influence the levels. There's kind of a puzzle solving focus almost, where it's like figuring out, this information is kind of half the battle in a lot of ways. And the platforming mechanics themselves, there are a lot of moves, but they're not really movement based. They're more utility based, where you have different moves for defeating different enemies. There's kind of a correct solution to most enemies, most problems, most gameplay scenarios. And for a game like Banjo-Kazooie, this could have led to disaster. This could have been a game where it really feels like very uninvolved from the player. It could be, kind of just like feel like you're not really thinking much. It's just like, oh yeah, it's kind of like, like a lot of puzzles, like once you know the solution, that's it. But what kind of keeps Banjo-Kazooie so fun is that the focus on feel and presentation really works in kind of a very fun, obvious way, where the game's world is just very whimsical, very inviting, very appealing, to where these kind of puzzle solutions are fun and they're cool to kind of live within, because you want to be part of that, you want to be part of the joy. Banjo-Kazooie is about joy, and it kind of, the appeal of collecting moves and abilities is satisfying in of itself, which you can kind of make ties to the way RPG systems are fun, because leveling up is just intrinsically rewarding. Maybe you're not getting objectively better, maybe you're just pressing the A button, but there is something to be said about just the fun of seeing numbers go up, seeing your abilities increase, and by the end being like, look at all the things I can do. it's, kind of a Metroid-like appeal, which, Metroid is kind of combining the platformer with adventure game elements in terms of unlocking new abilities and being able to traverse more parts of the map. But Banjo Kazooie being in 3D kind of goes back into the adventure, more to the classical adventure kind of version of that idea. And I think it's just a fascinating game that I think it's held up, to be honest. And it also kind of benefits from having very tight level design. It's weird to say that because there's so many random abilities and moves, a lot of which are very situational, almost useless in a way. But the smallness of the map kind of justifies this. It makes it so that like it feels less like, you have this big it feels less like you're kind of forced to find the right solution, more like you have this giant bag of tricks, and at any moment one of them could be used, like Zelda items in a way, because a lot of Zelda items are pretty useless and they have small use appeals, but it's still fun because finding those uses is still rewarding, and it's fun, and they all have different cool graphics, and it's just, there's an appeal there. And yeah, I don't know, Banjo Kazooie, it's a very fun game, very difficult in some ways. That kind of like objectivity to its design can be frustrating when they do ask a little bit too much, because it's kind of hard to optimize your play. But I will say that some of the actual platforming challenges, like Rusty Bucket Bay, are so difficult and like demanding that they're kind of fun in a way. And like that kind of Battletoads, so difficult, you gotta be perfect kind of way. It's hard to explain. Grunty, the final boss, is also fun in that way where it's just so difficult, but like, and it's very memorization based. I guess you could say it's a kind of a Donkey Kong Country kind of element, but it's still just fun and rewarding. And I don't know, Banjo Kazooie, it wasn't. It's hard to say if the formula itself is flawed, and that would become very obvious with Rareware's next titles when they kind of tried to expand it in different ways, pushing and pulling at the elements of Banjo Kazooie, and kind of leading to subpar results. But the game itself is just so infectiously optimistic, so tight, so fun, so dead set on just making you smile that it's hard to see it as anything other than a classic.